Good morning. It is Friday, September the 6th, and this is The Drill. Thank you very much. I'm Ron, your host, the only conservative in the United States of America today, because I'm the only one who knows what it means to be a conservative. This as opposed to Rush Limbaugh, who is not a conservative, but a reactionary traditionalist. My podcast is about being a true conservative and using true conservatism to beat the left each and every day. My podcast is made possible by Spreaker.com. It can be heard on iTunes, Spotify, Google, and YouTube. My email address is storytimes@hotmail.com. I'm on Twitter @Ronald Hardgrove and on Facebook @The Drill. I started my socio-political odyssey as a conservative Republican. Then I became a card-carrying member of the Libertarian Party, and now I am a registered independent and true conservative. I was taught by the left how to dress, how to act, what to take seriously, and who to associate with. When I decided to vote for Republican, I thought I could act like a liberal but vote conservative and still consider myself a conservative. I was wrong because I couldn't be taken seriously. I talked conservative, but I acted left. I used lefty lingo, I dressed like the left, I engaged in petty vice, and associated with people who engaged in vice. People who used drugs, gambled, consorted with prostitutes, stole, and cheated. It was no wonder that the people around me didn't take me seriously. So I realized that defeating the liberals and socialists starts with me getting my act together. Not only voting conservative, but by talking, dressing, and acting conservative. By refusing to associate with common criminals and ne'er-do-wells. By being aware of and resisting left-wing counterculture. By becoming a true conservative, I will not only win, I will never lose. The purpose of my broadcast is to share with my audience the lessons I have learned on how to defeat the left each and every day. On the show today, my monologue is going to be about an arbitrary claim as it applies to the NRA, and then I'm going to read Chapter 2 from the book, The Secret Knowledge, and then I will conclude the introduction from the book, How We Got Here, the 70s, when I come back. Thank you, and welcome back. The NRA needs to sue the city of San Francisco for defamation. The claim the city made about the NRA in an ordinance that it passed was an arbitrary claim. Any claim that is made without evidence to support it is an arbitrary claim. Any arbitrary claim that injures another party, in this case the NRA and its members, is defamatory and actionable. Most of the time, the proper response to an arbitrary claim is to ignore it. In this case, legal action is called for, and the NRA should sue the city of San Francisco for defamation. When I come back, I'll be reading Chapter 2 from the book, The Secret Knowledge. Thank you, and welcome back. And now, Chapter 2 from the book, The Secret Knowledge by David Mamet, and it's titled, The American Reality. It was observed, and I cannot remember by whom, quote, like all prolific writers, he was very lazy, unquote. This is certainly true of me. I am prolific and look upon my lengthy and various credits as must an inveterate debtor look upon the completed list of his obligations. It fills me with shame. Why? Perhaps because none of it felt like work, but like escape. What sort of sick fool would need to still so many terrifying thoughts by so much production? In any case, I've been granted the dispensation to spend my days making the unpleasant pleasant. By whom was I granted this right? By society in which I live, which found my work sufficiently diverting to pay me to sit alone all day and continue as I had begun. Leisure for reflection, somewhere near the end of a long career, leads me to thank God for allowing me to live in a society sufficiently free of governmental control to allow the citizenry expression of its true diversity, which is to say, diversity of thought. For, certainly, my works do not please everyone, but I, discovering that which does not please, am free to chase the market, to persist as before, or to desist entirely. I am, in short, free to fail, which means I am free to succeed, and, if successful, to enjoy any particularities which such success might confer upon me. This is not only the American dream, but the American reality, my growing realization of which prompted me to write this book. I spoke with my first conservative at age 60. My rabbi, Mordecai Finley, a centrist and founding member of his temple, took the time to talk to me. I was impressed not by their politics, which at the time made no sense to me, but by their politeness and patience. They gave me a book, and the book was White Guilt by Shelby Steele. It brought to mind an old Providence, Rhode Island answer to a difficult question. What do you want, the truth or a lie? Having spent my life in the theater, I knew that people could be formed into an audience. That is, a group which surrenders for 2 hours part of its rationality in order to enjoy an illusion. As I began reading and thinking about politics, I saw, to my horror, how easily people could also assemble themselves into a mob, which would either attract or be called into being by those who profited from the surrender of reason and liberty, and that these people are called politicians. My question then was that as we cannot live without government, how must we deal with those who would be inclined to abuse it, the politicians and their manipulators? The answer to that question, I realized, was attempted in the U.S. Constitution, a document based not upon the philosophic assumption that people are basically good, but on the tragic confession of the opposite view. I examined my liberalism and found it like an addiction to roulette. Here, though the odds are plain, and the certainty of loss apparent to anyone with a knowledge of arithmetic, the addict, failing time and again, is convinced he yet is graced with the power to contravene natural laws. The roulette addict, when he inevitably comes to grief, does not examine either the nature of roulette or his delusion, but retires to develop a new system and to scheme for more funds. The great wickedness of liberalism I saw was that those who devise the ever-new state utopias, whether crooks or fools, set out to bankrupt and restrict not themselves, but others. I saw that I had been living in a state of ignorance, accepting an unexamined illusion and calling it compassion, but that there were those brave enough to work their way through the prevailing slogans of their time and reason toward a consistent, practicable understanding of human relations. To these, politics was not the manipulation of the ignorant and undecided, but the dedication to the defense and implementation of just first principles. For example, those of the United States Constitution. I saw that to proclaim these beliefs in individual freedom, in individual liberty, and inevitable evil of surrender of powers to the state was, in the general population, difficult, and in the liberal environment, literally impossible. But yet men and women of courage devoted their lives and energies to doing so, undeterred not only by scorn, but by despair. I will now quote 2 Chicago writers on the subject. The first, William Shakespeare, who wrote, quote, "Truth's a dog must to kennel, he must be whipped out, when Lady the Brack may stand by the fire and stink," unquote. The second, Ernest Hemingway, quote, "Call 'em like you see 'em, and to hell with it," unquote. And that was chapter 2 of The Secret Knowledge. When I come back, I'll be reading from the book, How We Got Here. It's going to be actually from the introduction of the book, How We Got Here, the 70s. Thank you very much. Welcome back. And this is concluding the introduction to the book, How We Got Here, the 70s. Arrested, but almost certainly not punished, American society had made quiet collective decision in the 50s and early 60s to view crime more indulgently. This disinclination to arrest and punish was inspired by 2 powerful emotions, pride and guilt. And there, he's talking about arrested was 4,500 looters in a riot in Chicago that were arrested. Pride. Mid-century Americans felt much more certain than we do now that they had unlocked the secrets of human behavior. In the area of B.F. Skinner, explaining human conduct in moralistic terms, exposed one as sadly out of date. Just as madness had been transmuted into mental illness and idleness into unemployment, so crime was reinterpreted as delinquency, an unfortunate inability to bring one's conduct into line with the expectations of society. And as it was cruel and futile to jail the mentally ill and the unemployed, it was very nearly as foolish to jail the delinquent. The intelligent thing to do from everybody's point of view was to rehabilitate the delinquent, or, even better, prevent delinquency from arising in the first place by rooting out the causes of crime. True, there was the awkward difficulty that nobody could agree on what those all-important causes might be. Was crime a psychological problem, or was it a sociological problem? But whatever caused crime, thoughtful Americans refused to accept punishment as anything but a last desperate resort, and they judged the need for punishment a failure, as much of society as of the delinquent himself. Guilt. In the 1960s, punishing crime stringently inevitably meant punishing blacks disproportionately. Before World War II, crime and race were two quite distinct subjects in the northern and western states. Of the 2,100 felons sentenced to New York State penitentiaries in the year ending in June 1941, some 1,600 were white. The stereotypical criminal in the cities of the North was the Irish tough in his knit sweater and derby hat, the Sicilian hoodlum with his greased hair and knife, or the Jewish bootlegger and pimp. Of the 2,100 convicts sentenced in 1941, 145 had been raised in what the state called the Hebrew faith. Between 1940 and 1960, however, some 2 million blacks migrated northward in search of better opportunities. As the sons and grandsons of the migrants came of age, the face of crime in the north and west darkened. In the 1960s, blacks, 12% of the population, committed more than half of the nation's serious crimes. Embarrassed judges and juries refrained from convicting and jailing criminals. Parole boards set prisoners free earlier and with fewer questions asked. Reported crime rates more than doubled between 1960 and 1970, but the total number of criminals in prison actually fell from 212,953 federal and state inmates in 1960 to 196,429 in 1970. Policing lapsed. The population in the city of Los Angeles, for example, grew by 30% between 1950 and 1996. Over those same 16 years, the Los Angeles Police Department added 698 officers to its 1950 roster of 4,442, an increase of only 15%. The death penalty was quietly abandoned, although the number of murders in the United States jumped from 9,000 in 1960 to 15,000 in 1970, and more than 20,000 in 1975. Only 3 men suffered the maximum punishment for first-degree murder in the whole United States in the 14 years between 1965 and 1979. Despite a Supreme Court decision in 1976 reaffirming capital punishment's constitutionality. Ex-convicts could no longer be denied the right to vote. The California Supreme Court held in a 7-0 decision in March 1973. In February 1975, Vaughn Booker of Pennsylvania, who was serving a life sentence for killing his wife, was made a deacon of the chapel of Greater Ford State Prison, the first convicted murderer ordained by the Episcopal Church. It neatly symbolized the new tenderness toward criminality when the New York Times in 1977 purged from its style book the rule that convicted felons were to be referred to only by their last names. Henceforth, they were to be Mr., Mrs., or Miss, just like everyone else. Since the causes of crime were increasingly attributed to society rather than the criminal, the federal government and the states very logically hurled themselves with enthusiasm into the task of social reform, building public housing, funding summer jobs for youth, boosting welfare payments, squeezing the unemployment rate toward 3%, outlawing discrimination in hiring, housing, and public accommodation, appropriating billions of dollars for federal aid for early childhood education, and on, in fulfillment of all the most precious hopes of every criminologist ever to bring home a degree from the fabled University of Chicago sociology department. No gardener ever attacked root causes more vigorously. Alas, the more tenderly society tried to salvage its delinquents, the more crime it got. We're still arguing over precisely what went wrong. Was it that welfare weakened family structures and multiplied the number of fatherless young men seeking to prove their manhood? Did criminals rationally assess the risks of getting caught and decide that crime paid better than it used to? Did the relatively declining pay for unskilled work after 1973 lure uneducated young men into criminal careers? Did a century of black rage and resentment finally explode into an undeclared guerrilla war? Or was it perhaps a little of each and every one of these explanations and a dozen others beside that caused the post-1960 crime surge? For our story, what matters is not the origins of the crime wave, but its result. In the span of a very few years, the explosion of criminality utterly discredited the liberal ideas that had governed American public life since the war. It was already true in 1965 that a majority of Americans felt that the courts treated crime too leniently, but this sort of law and order conservatism remained a redneck view. In 1965, the majority of college-educated Americans still believed that the courts were either getting crime right or should become more lenient still. When the question about the leniency of the courts was repeated in 1974, the college graduates were nearly as furious at the courts as their less credentialed neighbors. A crushing 85% majority damned the courts as too soft, and this time there was no difference between the replies of men and women or between high school dropouts and holders of postgraduate degrees. Between 1949 and 1973, the proportion of Americans expressing great confidence in the Supreme Court plunged from 83.4% to 32.6% in the University of Michigan's poll and to 28% in the Lou Harris poll, the steepest drop for any branch of government. So, back in a minute. And the last book that I was reading, How We Got Here, the 70s, was written by David Frum. So, who are the true conservatives? They are the people that understand that conservatism is not just political, but cultural as well. They are patriotic people who use common sense. They make judgments, refuse to speculate, speak clearly and definitively, and are not afraid to say no. They are open-minded, asking why rather than why not. They are consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of their existence, unafraid to learn or correct their mistakes. They are normal Americans. And that brings me to the conclusion of another episode of The Drill. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.